Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm still Seth Monahan, that guy you probably hated in the front row of theory class, and this is video number 24 in my series on classical harmony and counterpoint. And I'm glad you tuned in because today we're going to get to know one of the most important chords in the classical style, but one that's also tricky for beginners. It's called the Cadential 6/4. Now, right up front, I need you to know two things about the Cadential 6/4. First, it's not really a new chord at all. It's been right under our noses since video 16 when I introduced the Big 18. It's this chord right here, the 1/6/4 with the dominant function. We've seen about 1 million of those so far. What changes today is the way we're going to think about that chord and, as a result, how we're going to label it. The second thing I need you to know is that the new ways we're going to think about and label this chord all stem from the work we did in the last video, video number 23. So if you haven't watched that one yet, do yourself a favor and go watch it now. I made it specifically to prevent the most common misunderstandings here, so you're going to be at a real disadvantage without it. And so to prove to you that I'm not lying about video 23 being critical here, I'm going to start with a quick review of what we learned there. As I hope you remember, Lesson 23 showed some of the ways that we can use figure bass to show non-chord tones resolving, particularly groups of non-chord tones moving together. And in that video, we came across 3 different kinds of scenarios, which I'm going to recap here. They all have a few things in common. Namely, they all have 2 or more upper voices moving over a stationary bass note, and some of those motions are going to involve the resolution of non-chord tones. We can spot the difference between these scenarios by asking 2 questions. First, do the non-chord tones arrive with the bass note, or do they come after it? And second, do those non-chord tones at any point combine to make something that looks like an actual chord, like something we have a name for? So here's an instance of each of the 3 scenarios using passages we actually looked at in video 23. Hopefully they'll sound familiar. In all of them, I'm showing non-chord tones in red, not just in the music, which I've done all along, but also in the bass figures that correspond to the non-chord tones. Here's the first scenario. In this one, the non-chord tones do arrive at the same time as the bass note. F is the bass note, and the notes directly above it, G, E, and B flat, are all non-chord tones. But the non-chord tones do not combine to make anything we would confuse with an actual chord. The bass figures 9, 7, 4 don't correspond to any known chord, and the sound of that cluster makes pretty clear we're dealing with a big pile of notes that need to resolve. And we can see from the music and the figures they do resolve into the notes of F major, the harmony that's active here. In the second situation, we have exactly the opposite. Now the non-chord tones arrive after the bass note. So the upper voices start on chord tones and then move away. But here's the thing. In this case, the non-chord tones combine to make things that do look like real chords. The first pair makes a 6/4 sonority, and the second pair makes a 4/2 sonority. Those are chord types that we know. Now, in video 23, I argued that most musicians won't hear these as real chords. If they were real chords, we wouldn't have non-chord tones in this bar. It's better, I think, to think of them as apparent chords or pseudo chords, which means they don't get their own Roman numerals. There's one Roman numeral here, and it's 1. Now, in the third scenario, we're going to check both boxes. The non-chord tones arrive with the bass note, in this case D natural, but they also combine to create something that looks, on paper at least, like a real chord. They're a 6th and a 4th above the bass note. As the red figures show, they make a 6/4 chord. But this is potentially really confusing, because right there, under the music, is the notation 6/6/4. Until now, you'd have every reason to assume that that means we're dealing with a 2nd inversion 6 chord. But we're not. We have to widen our view and understand from context here that the 6 and the 4 refer to non-chord tones that eventually resolve to chord tones within a root position 6 chord. Remember our pro tip from last time. Whenever an analysis shows 6/4 moving to 5/3 over a stationary bass with those little horizontal lines, the 6/4 doesn't go with the Roman numeral it's next to. The figures aren't telling us about chord inversions. They're telling us about the movement of non-chord tones in the upper voices. Now, if you understand this, if you get why we notate scenario 3 the way we do and how it's potentially confusing to students who think that figure bass only exists to show chord inversions, then the cadential 6/4 won't pose any problems at all. To see what I mean, let's go back to the passage that scenario 3 came from originally. This is the slow movement of Mozart's K330 piano sonata. Now, in the last video, I had you listen for any spots where several upper voices moved together over a stationary bass. The first one was here, and we analyzed it just now, like this. When you listen, now focus on the second one, and really just notice how similar it sounds and feels to that first one. So the two bars I've circled here are extremely similar in some respects. Both have a stationary bass with a 6/4 sonority followed by a 5/3 sonority, with all of the upper voices that move descending by step. But until now in this series, we would have analyzed this bar in a totally different way. We would have looked at the downbeat and said, hey, there's a 1/6/4 chord. And then we would have looked at beat 2 and said, hey, there's a 5 chord. In other words, we would have analyzed this as two chords with no non-chord tones. But now, with the tools we've picked up in video 23, we have a different way of looking at it. We could instead analyze it exactly the same as bar 2, which is to say, as a single harmony, a dominant triad with accented non-chord tones on the downbeat. And as it happens, there are lots of reasons to prefer this second interpretation, as all music theorists do today. Let's put the two of them side by side for a second. On the left is our old interpretation with 1/6/4. And as far as I can tell, this has one and only one thing going for it. The label 1/6/4 is literally accurate. If we look at only the notes on the downbeat, it's a tonic chord, tonic triad, F major, in second inversion. So the one reason turns out to be a pretty good one. We might want to call the cadential 6/4 a 1/6/4 because it is a 1/6/4. So why do music theorists cringe when we call it that? One reason is that the Roman numeral 1 brings a lot of unwanted baggage with it. To put it bluntly, this chord is just nothing like a tonic chord. In tonal music, the tonic is supposed to be our most stable chord. It's our home base, our safe harbor. So it bugs people like me to put a Roman numeral 1 under one of the least stable harmonies we find in all this music. Indeed, it's so unstable that analysts deny that it's an independent chord at all. Now, up to this point in this series, we've kind of tried to have it both ways by calling 1/6/4 a tonic chord with a dominant function. And that makes some sense, right? Mainly because 1/6/4 often comes right after a predominant. But if we really think about it, 1/6/4 isn't much like a dominant chord either. At least not any of the ones we know. We never see it alone. It's never the only dominant chord in a functional cycle. It always proceeds to 5 or 5/7. And unlike every other dominant chord on the planet, it never goes directly to tonic. And it's actually much less stable than many dominant function chords. You can end a phrase on a 5 chord or even a 5/7 chord, but try ending a phrase on a 1/6/4 chord. If you know the style, it sounds ridiculous. Here's the opening phrase of the slow movement from Beethoven's Second Piano Concerto, trimmed to end on a 1/6/4. If you know the style, it's totally unacceptable to end on that last chord. Those top notes are begging to resolve into more stable tones. Here's another one from Haydn's Miracle Symphony. The miracle would be if Haydn wrote something that sounded that goofy. Obviously, the phrase is supposed to end like this. So let's sum up the pros of the notation on the right. So now the function and the Roman numeral agree. It all just says dominant. Great. Second, it treats this idiom as one event, not, quote, two chords, which is appropriate because the 164 is never alone. It always goes on to another dominant. Another pro is that performers almost always play the upper voices as though they were non-chord tones, which is to say they accent them, they lean into them, they play them like dissonances that need to resolve. And don't just listen to me, listen to John Eliot Gardner playing that Beethoven phrase again. He plays those red notes like appoggiaturas, not like chord tones. So really, the only strike we've got against the one on the right is that the notation is a little bit confusing at first. But it does ultimately make sense. It is manageable. So everyone say bye-bye to 164 for now anyway. And let's pause to make sure we know all the key points about the cadential 6/4. So from the top, the cadential 6/4 is a 6/4 chord with scale degree 5 in the bass. And that bass note is always doubled in an upper voice. It contains the notes of the tonic triad, but several of those notes are actually non-chord tones because the actual harmony here is 5, and those non-chord tones need to resolve into the notes of the 5 chord, usually downward. And we show these resolutions with figured bass and horizontal lines. The chord usually appears on a strong beat, and we can find it at half cadences, as shown here, or at authentic cadences, like this. Here's something new, though, something we haven't seen yet. The cadential 6/4 can also resolve to a 5/7 chord rather than a triad 5. Thankfully, this is easy. If you voice your cadential 6/4 correctly, then all of the upper voices will simply resolve downward by step. So in this case, we'll take that C, the doubled bass note, and we'll have it move down by step at the same time as everyone else into a full-blown 5/7 chord. And to show this in the analysis, we now need 3 levels of figured bass. Look over here again on the right. Now we need an 8 followed by a 7 to show that that C above the bass dropped by step to a B flat, a 7th above the bass. Mozart uses exactly this kind of textbook voice leading in the parallel period that opens his A major piano sonata. The first phrase uses only 3 voices, so when he gets to the half cadence, he doesn't have to double the bass note, he just sets up the cadential 6/4 and brings those upper voices down by step. It sounds like this. Now, in the consequent phrase, he needs a PAC at the end, and for that, he probably wants a 5/7 chord in the cadence. So at the very end of the phrase, he switches into 4 voices, and we can see exactly that super simple voice leading I told you about. When 5 arrives in the bass, he's got the notes of the tonic triad above with the bass doubled. Then he moves everybody down by step into 5/7, and then onward to tonic. Now, it's important to know about this quote-unquote textbook voice leading if you're, say, taking a class where you're expected to voice lead these chords yourself. But you also need to know that in real music, composers don't always do it this way. In fact, very often the voice leading from the cadential 6/4 into 5/7 in particular is actually pretty messy. Here's the very end of the Beethoven theme we studied in the last video, the one where we learned how to show a 9/7/4 suspension at the cadence. Here, Beethoven sets up the cadential 6/4 as a block chord. But the 5/7 that follows is arpeggiated in two directions at once, with each chord tone appearing in two different registers. So there's no tidy set of stepwise motions that takes us from one chord to the next. What I mean is that in the so-called textbook voice leading, this F, a fourth above the bass, should drop by step to an E. But the E it resolves to is actually a step plus an octave lower, and then a half a beat later in the right octave but in the wrong hand. It's messy. But here's the thing, we still use the same analytical notation as before, even though the figured bass no longer describes the motion of actual individual voices. Now the figured bass is telling us what the kind of idealized version of the voice leading would be, which is quite different from what Beethoven actually wrote. And that's fine, it still sounds like a cadential 6/4 resolving to dominant. I want to look quickly at three more instances of messy voice leading. In this one, from Beethoven's last Opus 10 piano sonata, we see a very common melodic pattern. The cadential 6/4 has scale degree 5 in the melody, which leaps down by sixth to the leading tone in the dominant chord. And all the other voices participate in this downward plunge as well. And this makes it feel like we're kind of crashing down tragically into that D minor tonic chord. This kind of downward leap into the cadential leading tone happens all the time in real music. In this cadence, from Beethoven's Opus 28 sonata, we leap downward from scale degree 3 through the interval of a diminished fourth into the leading tone. But in this case, the other voices basically just stay in their original register, so the effect is maybe a little bit less dramatic. Our last one shows a different kind of messy voice leading. This is from Mozart's early F major piano sonata, and I'll warn you, this is going to get a little more complicated, but also, I think, very interesting. So if you don't like interesting, and you just want to do the basics, skip on ahead to the next section. But for those of you who want to do a deep dive here, we can start by noticing that the closing tonic has the same 9/7/4 suspension we keep seeing. Of course, the tonic is minor now. But mainly let's focus on bar 1. So what's new here is that Mozart decorates the dominant and the cadential 6/4 with embellishing tones. To understand what this means, we have to do a bit of listening below the surface, the sort of thing I talked about in video 22. I'm going to play a recording, and I want you to hear it the way I've analyzed it here, which is to say, hearing two main harmonic events in bar 1. A full compound beat of the cadential 6/4 and a full compound beat of 5/7. Now, to hear two harmonic events in that bar, only two harmonic events, we had to ignore a few notes. These red notes, those are easy. Those are passing tones connecting notes of the 5/7 chord. Now, they do happen to make a 1/6/4 for a fleeting second, but I'm choosing just to ignore that because F and A here feel purely melodic to me. I don't need those two notes to show up in my harmonic analysis at all. Now look at the purple notes. I'm calling these lower neighbor notes to the notes of the cadential 6/4. But this brings us to a kind of paradox, right? Because now we're embellishing non-chord tones with their own neighbor notes. This actually happens a lot, although we haven't seen it yet in these videos. So it turns out that even among non-chord tones, some are ranked higher than others. The thing that's really tricky here, though, is that these purple embellishments, which I'm calling neighbor notes to other neighbor notes, are technically chord tones. It's E and G, they're part of the dominant chord. So we could, in principle, have analyzed it like this instead. This treats the purple notes as run-of-the-mill chord tones, E and G, the chordal third and chordal fifth. But I don't like this because it says that the purple E and G are basically the same as this E and G. But that's not how I hear it. I hear the purple E and G as much more subordinate, decorating the notes of the Cadential 6/4. I like the idea that there are really only two harmonic events here, a Cadential 6/4 and a 5/7 with a bit of melodic noodling above it. Ya da 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 dum. So let's listen again. Okay, enough of that. I want to wrap up by looking at two situations you should know about. The first is an irregular resolution of the Cadential 6/4 chord. And for this, I want to go back to a passage that we looked at in video 13 from Beethoven's Opus 101 Piano Sonata. The passage on screen shows the cadence that closes the first large section of the sonata, or actually in E major here. But it's not quite what Beethoven wrote. It shows what would have happened if his big Cadential 6/4 had resolved normally. Have a listen. Notice also that this version uses the textbook voice leading we saw earlier. Once we're ready to move out of the Cadential 6/4, all three voices simply drop by step. Here's what Beethoven actually wrote. The difference is here. Instead of having all three upper voices drop by step, he has two upper voices and the bass voice drop by step. That means the Cadential 6/4 resolves into a 5/4-2 chord, and we already know that 5/4-2 itself has to resolve to 1/6, meaning that there isn't a cadence here at all. You can't have a cadence with 1/6. And this means, to use the terms we learned in video 13, the cadence has been evaded. And as is so often the case, Beethoven doesn't just evade the cadence once, he does it twice before finally landing on a proper PAC. Here's the whole passage. So the last point I want to make is that the Cadential 6/4 is not the only 6/4 we find over the dominant note in the bass. Have a look at this passage from Mozart's K545 Sonata. We're in C major here, and Mozart's building toward a half cadence in the third bar. Notice that when the dominant arrives on the downbeat of the second bar, it's an unembellished, plain vanilla dominant triad. But then over the course of the bar, Mozart moves twice into a 6/4 sonority. This is the same sonority as the Cadential 6/4, which is to say it's got the notes of the tonic over a dominant bass. But these aren't Cadential 6/4s per se because the bass is already on the dominant note when they arrive. Cadential 6/4s tend to arrive at the same moment as the dominant bass, not after. But this is still a really common idiom. It's called the pedal 6/4 because the bass stays put like a pedal point while the upper voices move away from their original position to make a 6/4 sonority. Here, have another listen. All right, enough of that too. This video has been too long, and if you made it this far, there might actually be something wrong with you. But I'm grateful that you stuck around. And now you know more about the Cadential 6/4 than anyone else in your class, and maybe your teacher too. So show it off, and I'll see you next time.